Hello, Matt.
Hey, Bill, how are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
It's been quite a week.
Yes, it has. Yes, it has.
Perhaps not the bloggiest week.
No, not a blog week. Not a new media week per se, but I think
I do think there's this notion out there, going back to the Sunday night announcement, that Twitter scooped the media. I've heard that repeated a lot on Twitter. I don't buy it myself, but I don't know if you feel like Twitter played some special role Sunday night.
No, I found out about it on TV, and somebody, I forget who it was, but somebody ironically tweeted out a link demonstrating that TV actually beat Twitter with this story. But there have been other stories. I mean, I can tell you that sometimes Twitter does serve as a canary in a coal mine. I remember when Sarah Palin gave that speech announcing she would be stepping down as governor. I started seeing things pop up on Twitter about an hour or so before, sort of rumors. And at first you're very skeptical, is there any legitimacy to this? About an hour before, maybe even longer before cable TV picked it up. But I think with a story like this, a story that is intentionally secretive, intentionally, the government is releasing information. I don't know that Twitter has that same competitive advantage as it might if, Joe Blow, a friend of Palin's or a consultant, tells his mistress, I don't know, and they tweet it out. I mean, so...
Right, I mean, it gives this, false sense of competitive advantage in a high-profile story, like either a Palin announcement or a presidential announcement. And if there's an announcement from a political figure, and it's a staged announcement, it's something that is orchestrated. There's always going to be a series of phone calls made to other political officials before the figure walks out to the podium.
Right.
And that's going to lead to a small burst of gossip, and so that's going to bleed onto, a social media site.
But not the case with information which is, confidential information, top secret information. Less likely that Twitter would get it first, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, there's nothing that Twitter does uniquely that ferrets out information. I mean, it's not a substitute for reporting. So to even contrast a situation like that with what is a finer mode of journalism, I mean, Twitter is not journalism.
Well, let me give you an example of how the Palin thing sort of helped me. Because if you'll remember, when Palin made this announcement, it was about a year and a half, 2 years ago, and it was on, like, the 4th of July or Labor Day or something. Memorial Day, I don't remember, but a lot of people were out of town. And I started seeing this stuff pop up. And at first it was people on Twitter that I didn't know necessarily, and so I didn't know if they were credible. But I basically got ready to go on TV because everybody else was out of town. Chuck Todd was in Rehoboth Beach or something. So there weren't, there were like very few people who could talk about this topic, and so I it alerted me to it, and then the next thing that happened, way before cable TV started talking about it, was you had like reputable reporters on Twitter tweeting it. So, like for example, I don't know who it was, but it could have been like Mark Amender from The Atlantic. Somebody, they weren't going on TV talking about it yet, but they were. Now you had reputable reporters tweeting it. Which I guess, it was still rumor, but it was. I'm hearing this is going to happen. I'm hearing that Palin is going to step down or whatnot.
Well, I mean, and that's where Twitter is of some value, or one of the ways, because you can easily plug into any kind of community conversation, whether it's a Washington Insider conversation or otherwise. And be sort of a fly on the wall to an extent, but plenty of rumors that fly by conversations like that will end up not being true.
But I guess this guy Keith Urban, right? Wasn't he like press secretary for Rumsfeld or something?
Well, this is how I think I think there was some spitballing on Twitter that was completely uninformed speculation. Just what could this be? People throwing out ideas, but Rumsfeld's chief of staff was the first semi-knowledgeable person to say, and he said it on his Twitter feed, "I heard from a congressional staffer that this is to announce that bin Laden is dead."
Right.
Hot damn.
And what's funny is I think the tweet right before that he was tweeting about the Washington Capitol. So it just goes to show you like how how weird this medium is.
Right. So it's interesting that the information spread out that way, and perhaps more people who might otherwise be turning in to go to bed on Sunday night on the East Coast, people maybe would start buzzing about it more. Maybe more people tuned in to hear the president because there was some sense of what it was going to be about. And that's interesting. I'm not saying it's not useful in its way, but it's not a substitute for actual reporting. It doesn't mean that journalists were failures because they didn't announce this before the president uttered a word, before checking the facts themselves. And as we know, and this may lead into another conversation to have, to know the exact specifics on how this happened requires actual journalism. It functions that Twitter just is not intended to do. It's not an insult to Twitter to say they can't be journalists. It's not what Twitter is about. And it's not an insult to journalism to say some gossip's going to hit Twitter before a reporter can check all the facts.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is there's really two things at play here. One, a lot of people on Twitter, most people on Twitter aren't journalists. And so they, and some of them are anonymous. So, I mean, if they're wrong about something, there isn't any repercussions. Whereas, obviously, there are for journalists. But the other thing, though, I think is even journalists on Twitter see the bar for what they would tweet is much lower than the bar for what they would go on air with. So they might tweet out, hey, I'm hearing rumors that something big is happening. Might it be bin Laden? We'll see. They might tweet that out. You would never go on TV and, pull the, interrupt, a rerun of The Office to come on and say, hey, we're hearing something big's happening. We're not sure what, but we're keeping it on. It just doesn't happen. It's a less formal, medium.
Right. Now, the other interesting Twitter story, of course, is the person in Pakistan that overheard this, or that a neighbor of the bin Laden compound who unwittingly tweeted what was happening in the middle of the night. And he seemed almost a little overwhelmed by the attention he was getting, because obviously he wasn't intending to be in the middle of one of the biggest international stories of the decade, if not a century. But it does go to show how interconnected the world is, and that few things can happen without someone being in earshot and someone making mention of it. And it does provide, an extra level of insight. And I don't want to overplay it because he didn't have that much insight in particular, but there's the potential to have, some sights and sounds of a situation where, a journalist, could not know to be. I mean, again, you wouldn't expect a journalist to be able to be staking out that compound before a special operations mission. So it is useful to get that kind of perspective when possible, and the way the world is interconnected, it becomes more likely that can happen.
That story struck me as weird. Weird that somebody next door would be on Twitter and that people would find out about it. But
and he's tweeting in English, no less.
Yeah, something about that strikes me as weird. But let's assume that it's all legit. You do make a valid point, which is that in this day and age, everybody to a certain degree has a microphone. Everybody has a camera. I mean, everybody's phone. Everybody can tweet. They can capture video. They can tape record, whatever. And so things that in the past, nobody would talk about, nobody would know about, everybody can capture now. So obviously a game changer there.
If I could digress for a bit, forgive me for a big digression. This whole notion of everyone has a microphone, everyone's a citizen journalist, I'm finding has an impact at the local politics level in a way that I don't think has been talked about very much. I've seen here in my my town in Western Massachusetts, a couple of instances in the past few years where the main local media outlet plays political campaigns very gingerly. They don't want to. They don't employ huge staff. They don't ferret out every last motion in a campaign the way that national, presidential campaign beat reporters try to do. There's local pressures to be very careful not to be seen as preferring one candidate over another, so that ends up raising a very high bar for what qualifies as news in a local political campaign. And that means that people, the quote-unquote citizen journalists, can do almost whatever. And it's not even just blogging or tweeting. It could be, email chains or chat rooms. And stuff about candidates, stuff that, can qualify as smears, can just shoot through an entire town and define a local political race without any actual journalistic institution even weighing in, even mentioning it. There's not even an attempt to fact-check some of this stuff. And that's the real downside to not having, actual media gatekeepers with editors, because there are negative possibilities with a complete Wild West free-for-all. So to circle that back to the Bin Laden operation, we have an actual issue here where we are fairly reliant on government sources for information, because only so many people were in the room at the time, and what information we get from outside the United States government are the survivors of the compound, and their information is not exactly unbiased.
Right.
So you really need actual journalists to dig in, check stories, compare testimonies, piece stuff together, and that kind of stuff citizen journalists just cannot do.
Well, it's an interesting tie-in to an actual new media story, which is Patch, AOL's Patch, where apparently Arianna Huffington had talked about how that would be an important part of her relationship with AOL, and she wrote a piece, I think yesterday, that says, Patch will provide an unprecedented infrastructure for citizen engagement in time for the 2012 presidential election, with a focus on community and local solutions. So, for what it's worth, that is, it could be an attempt for to sort of combine these two things: local coverage and yet some sort of gatekeeper.
Well, right, and this is there's a big question out there: is hyper local the next trend in new media? And I think the evidence has shown, financially speaking, very unlikely that hyperlocal sites can establish enough advertising revenue to sustain. Then the question is, can it sustain with national corporations backing like AOL? And we'll see. We'll see if Patch can do that. I think its record so far has been a little spotty. Might even say patchy. And to that end, I think to the extent the quality of the journalism is going to be patchy, I'm sure there'll be some examples where particular individuals in particular towns will do a bang-up job without having a traditional editor. But to argue that could be, a strong layer of journalism coast to coast, I just think is completely unrealistic. And so I don't see this as single-handedly filling the gap with good local political coverage, because most local coverage is dominated by local TV, and local TV tends to be very reliant on crime stories and weather, not about political coverage. So I don't see that hole being filled by the glorified citizen journalist.
There's a guy named Jeff Dunnett who blogs at Yid with a Lid. He's on Twitter. And he has a piece up essentially arguing that Huffington will use this local strategy to push her liberal ideology. So we shall see how that goes.
I mean, everyone's everyone's speculating what Ariana is going to do now that she has, that she's partnered with AOL. But I think so far, I wouldn't go as far as to say that there's no evidence of liberal belief on Huffington Post now, but I would say there's less of it since AOL. So I don't see the evidence that this is going to be that there is a massive Ariana conspiracy to turn the entire online world into a left-wing outpost. If anything, that part of the mission is being diluted.
Something to keep an eye on. We shall see what happens. I don't.
Well, to go back to the Bin Laden story and what I was hinting at earlier, the White House has had difficulty communicating to the public what exactly happened. There was one story told on Monday, and then key parts of that story were retracted and revised on Tuesday. I know Mark Halpern at the Mark Halpern at the page, so the Time Magazine site, was very critical of how the White House handled that. And I'm not arguing that it's good that they had to change their story, but I would note two things. One, just to pontificate briefly, if they weren't interested in telling the true story, there'd be no need to tell two stories. You would just stick with your first story and leave it at that. I think the fact that they told the second story was evidence that they are trying to get the correct information out there, and that can be difficult to do so. And I guess from the perspective of a voter or a news consumer, I think it may be hard to understand why this is so difficult. Why not get a story? Why wouldn't you just get it straight the first time? And I think the difficulty there is, one, everyone understands the concept of the fog of war, that things are going a mile a minute. Not everybody sees the same thing. Piecing together the complete story can be hard to do, if not impossible, at the end of the day. But then add to that the 24-hour media pressure that a lot of new media puts upon. To take 24-hour cable news, take Twitter, take Facebook, take blogging, everyone pounding on the door looking for the specifics. That puts undue pressure on a White House to get something out quickly, because they have an incentive. I'm not just trying to show the White House as being victims to the monstrous pressures of new media. The White House has an interest in setting the terms of the narrative, and so they want to get their story out there as fast as possible. They need to get out even faster than they would like, because of 24-hour media pressures. And that makes it hard to get all of the strands of information together to ensure that you have the absolute final word on the subject. And so I don't know exactly, what came across their transom that forced them to having to revise it, but it does show how difficult that job is. That a White House that I would argue is pretty diligent about its communications. And I'm sure many people on the left and right might disagree with that. I would say they're generally not sloppy about these sorts of things. They're quite understanding of how the media operates. That even people who have been quite expert at this stuff in the past, it's still just an inherently difficult
Yes,
job.
I think all those things are true, but some big things wrong. These aren't mistakes you make because you heard something wrong or because you don't understand military jargon. They said that Bin Laden had a gun, or that he was involved in a firefight. Turns out not to be true. They said that Bin Laden's wife was used as a human shield. That turns out not to be true. I mean, I don't see how you make that mistake. It's not like I misheard something. I think we give them the benefit of the doubt, at least for now, because they got the guy, right? That's what matters. This sort of leads into the whole thing without the, showing the pictures. I mean, here's what I'm sort of reading the tea leaves, and I think a lot of people are. I think what happened is they go in there, Bin Laden's unarmed, and they shoot him in the face. I personally don't have a problem with that. I don't care if he was holding up a white flag. I really don't care. But maybe they think it would look bad. Maybe they think that the quote-unquote international community might not understand that they, shot an unarmed man who perhaps was pleading for his life. I don't know. I think bin Laden had it coming. But something's weird, Bill. Something is weird about the way this has been told, and the misinformation, the number of things that were corrected. Am I wrong about that?
I mean, weird's not the word I would use. I don't think the fog of war is weird. I mean, we have plenty of examples in history of not just instances of war, but even the Gabrielle Gifford shooting. I mean, any time there is a chaotic scene, individual testimonies are not as reliable as you might think because people aren't calmly processing a lot of information. They're in the middle of a very adrenaline pumping situation, and that's why you have to take a breath and talk to several people and collect several testimonials and piece them together and figure, okay, who's telling me different things here? Why are these things conflicting? I got to then weigh that and figure out, who might have inadvertently gotten something wrong. Maybe someone told them something explicitly bad because they wanted to clean it up, and then they found out from 3 others that that's what happened. I don't know, but it would seem unlikely to me that the White House had deliberate motive to lie if they were only going to reverse those 24 hours later. That's not what liars do. So,
well, look, I mean, I think you make a good point. We know for a fact that people who are involved in an accident, for example, mix things up. Different people who observed it, different witnesses will swear up and down things happened differently. As you mentioned with Gabrielle Giffords, there were reports that she was dead. I remember the shooting, the Fort Hood shooting. There were a lot of erroneous reports coming out of that initially, but in those cases, it was done by the media, who were.
But someone had to tell the media something for them to report it.
Presumably somebody told them that she was dead. But my point is, the administration presumably had. This was a clandestine effort. Presumably had video and photography, and they could release this on their own timetable to a certain degree. I mean, they couldn't hold it for days, but I don't know that it's analogous. But again, it's not. It strikes me as more weird than problematic at this point. Just more like I'm scratching my head. They did such a great job of executing this mission, and yet the PR seems to have been not handled that well.
Well, certainly imperfecally. My only argument is that perfection might be an unrealistic expectation.
But look, I'd rather have them get killing bin Laden right and the PR and bungle the PR part than the other way around. So.
Right. Well, but to your other point about, it's that you don't care at all what the story is at this point. You're just happy that he's gone. I think from the White House's perspective, they didn't want to get him just to get him. There's not just the basic need to hold people accountable for their terrorist acts. There are also foreign policy implications here. They want this to be something that complements the push for democracy in the Middle East. They want this to break the back of al-Qaeda. They want this to make it easier to withdraw from Afghanistan. And if it inadvertently inflames the region, then that negates all those possible positive benefits.
Right. And so that's why I think if there is misinformation being fed to us, it may be for a really good reason. It might be that the fact that they went in there and shot an unarmed man in the face might not play well in the international community.
I would understand why they would want to lie about something.
I would understand that too.
I don't think the revision of the story doesn't suggest that that's what they were intending to do.
I don't know, and frankly, I don't care if they did that. I would not have a problem with it. But there may be people around there who would. So here's the other thing, Bill. These pictures, right? I think they're going to come out. I don't know. I mean, they're going to...
I saw Greg Mitchell, who writes for The Nation. he tweeted his own words, his guess that that someone will leak them out within the White House anyway, and just the president's fingerprints won't be on it. Then
I think that's true. Somebody will. I mean,
I don't. I mean, if that did happen, I don't think it would be a deliberate strategy. Again, I don't see how it makes the president look good to make such a bold proclamation. We don't do this, and have someone on his team then go ahead and do it. It doesn't. I don't see what the point of that would be. I mean, it might happen, but I can't see why it would be a deliberate White House strategy to embarrass the president like that.
Let's get back to I guess that is an interesting argument, and I don't think he's alone in making it. What I'm saying is that they cannot withhold the information, even if they want to. Because maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like in this modern era, it is impossible to control information like this. Now, maybe they could hold it for a year. I don't know. I just have it seems to me unbelievable that they can withhold this information from the public in this era. Just me.
It will be an interesting test whether such information can be held. I presume at the moment they are a circle of people that have seen the photos are extremely small. From what I can gather, the Congressional Intelligence Committees have not seen it. I thought I saw a headline saying that
they have. The chairman, Mike Rogers of the House Intel Committee, has seen it. He wants their 19 other members. He wants them all to see it, but as of this morning, they had not.
Now, what I don't understand there is, to sort of your point, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you care? It's one thing, I guess, to have a Sarah Palin argument that we should show them to the world. Screw you, world. We shot them in the face. Suck it. I mean, you think there's a foreign policy imperative to stick it in everyone's face. I completely reject the argument, but I understand where the argument's coming from. I don't understand the argument. I'm a member of the House Intelligence Committee. I want to see them because I want to see them. Like, what kind of help is it to their service on the House Intelligence Committee that they see a photo? I mean, are they questioning whether it happened? I don't.
Well, I think a couple things. One is, it sort of goes to this argument that I think is a bipartisan argument, which is that we have three branches of government, and that whether it's advice and consent or declaring war, I mean that at least they have some right to this information. I can tell you, Texas Rep. Mike Conaway, who's on the Intel Committee, said he wants to see it because I'd be able to tell my constituents, that I've seen it, that this is legit. So, I mean, that may not be.
That makes no sense to me. What constituent is going to go to their congressman and be upset that their representative didn't get a chance to see them? I can't imagine that every congressman.
Well, I'm not going to defend or argue that this is right or wrong, but if you're not going to let the public see it, then if they're a member of Congress, or at least if members on the Intel Committee of both political parties have seen it, they could vouch for it. Now, that argument is slightly undermined by the fact that Scott Brown said he saw the pictures and he can vouch that Bin Laden's dead because the picture he saw was completely bogus. And so you could Photoshop it.
Clearly his bogus pictures got circled around the Senate, and a number of people saw them. But Brown,
I thought you're a fan of
in Massachusetts.
You're on the Scott Brown.
Oh yeah, we're best buds. I love the guy. He went off to say that he saw it in an official briefing, which
it wasn't just that too. And I mean, I didn't know about that part, but I'll take your word on that, Bill. But the part that I thought was funny, at least, was when he said, "And take my word for it, he's dead." I saw those pictures in truck. So the point there is that if he could be fooled by an obvious bogus picture, the government, were they involved in a conspiracy, could clearly Photoshop pictures and show them to the Intel Committee. But,
Well, that's the other thing. I think one of the reasons why I imagine they came down against it. I mean, the initial thought was we want to make sure that the world knows this really happened. I think after 24 hours, it became clear that, look, if you're not going to buy it, you're not going to buy it. You'll say anything has been doctored if you don't want to believe it. And most rational people, regardless of your geographic location or religion or ideology, are going to realize, hey, I haven't heard from this Laden guy in a long time. Maybe he's not on anymore.
I gotta say too.
Hey, his daughter just told the Pakistani press, I saw him shot.
Well, but she also said that they were interrogating him, and then they shot him out of the blue or whatever, right? I mean, what was it? Who knows?
Right. I mean, it's possible that her story is not credible from top to bottom.
Her story is not credible. But look, what about?
But she started going out there saying he wasn't.
But what about the fact that they by the time most people hear about this, the guy's already in the ocean. That's not how I thought it would play out. I didn't think that they would dispose of the corpse immediately. I never imagined that would happen. Not saying it's a bad idea. Just I never saw that one coming.
Right. Well, that's the tough decision they had to make between making sure people believe this really happened and making sure that people thought that the aftermath was handled appropriately. And I know there are some folks on the right. I'm not saying this is the entire right because I don't know if it is. I know that the Pam Geller type faction, who are livid that we buried him under Muslim traditions.
Well, and then you have Charles Krauthammer, who loved it and was talking about how he's being eaten by fish as I speak, or something like that. So I mean,
right. But obviously, there's no way you're going to do this that is going to satisfy every last person on the planet. But as far as what could you do that would mitigate the possibility of intense backlash in the Muslim world, weighing all the different factors, it sure seems like there certainly have not been any kind of really massive outcries from the Arab Muslim world to date. There's not huge protests going on. They're mostly focused about finding democracy and freedom in their own countries at this point. They're not really focused on bin Laden, it seems. I mean, there may be a reprisal from an Al-Qaeda faction, but that kind of thing we have to guard against no matter what procedures were followed. This doesn't seem to have sparked any kind of larger upset in the Arab Muslim world, and I can only presume that those types of things that they did mitigated.
Yeah, and by the way, this is significant. I was talking to Garrett Graff, who's the editor of the Washingtonian magazine and author of a book called The Threat Matrix, who told me that this is a big symbolic win, not just for us, but that members of Al-Qaeda don't swear allegiance to Al-Qaeda, they swear allegiance to Osama bin Laden. And that this really, although he wasn't, necessarily calling all the shots operationally, that this really could deal a psychological blow to Al-Qaeda. So that would be a great thing.
I mean, maybe this shifts into a little 2012 discussion. We talked about this. We were a guest on David Pakman's online TV and terrestrial radio show. And I think we both were in agreement that this makes it at least harder for conservatives to further a narrative that the president is weak on national security, is always going on apology tours and bowing to other heads of state. It makes that a more uphill climb. And if what Graff is saying comes true, that this will have additional foreign policy benefits for not just the president, but for all of us, even more so. I would only think that 2012ers would be able to regain some footing on the issue if there was some other foreign policy debacle that occurred, or this actually did backfire in some way, and we had this huge spate of terror attacks. Then the argument might have made that you should have let him fester in his $1 million cave and not. By
the way, speaking of making it harder to argue he's a wimp, my colleague Carolyn May here at the Daily Caller has a great piece up called Barack Obama Killing Machine, and she actually lists to date all the people that Obama has authorized killing, including 3 Somali pirates and a whole bunch of people whose names I can't pronounce, including, well,
I recall you were very laudatory at the Somali pirate.
I was, even back then. Gaddafi's youngest son and 3 grandchildren, including on the list. And ordered the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki. She's got the whole list up there. And I wrote a piece explaining this whole thing. My argument is you might not like this bill. But Republicans now have this sort of conundrum, right? There's 2 narratives that you would generally decide on. He's either typical blame America first wimp. It's harder to argue that today. Or he is sort of a hypocrite who his campaign rhetoric, in order to get elected, bashed all the Bush policies, and then he just implemented them after being elected. I'm actually making the case at the Daily Caller that there's a third alternative, which is that the brilliance of the American system of checks and balances and holding politicians accountable by public opinion and re-election essentially forces them to behave very consistently. You might not like that, but check it out, and we can debate it.
Well, I don't agree to the extent that, it's like it's like Obama said in the campaign that he wasn't going to pursue bin Laden, or in fact he was making very strongly the case in the primaries that he would go into Pakistan if there was actionable intelligence and the Pakistanis.
No, that's a great.
And he got pushback on that, not from other Democrats and from.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And by the way, Bill, I put up something earlier this week that Mike Huckabee said the same thing, albeit after Obama, and McCain called it naive, I think. So, yeah.
Right. So, yeah, I put up a post that you guys might not like.
As your friend did the other day,
I do think that
Matt
there
K.
was.
Lewis.
I do think there is a foreign policy shift from Bush in this respect. I've always argued during the Bush era and today that the Bush administration had always planned to deprioritize counterterrorism in favor of focusing on rogue states. And they were dismissive of Clinton's focus on bin Laden coming into the White House. They adopted a lot of global war on terror rhetoric, but generally speaking, they deferred to Pakistan when the Pakistanis said, "You are not allowed to enter our sovereign territory with your troops." They adhered to that. They only did drone attacks. They aborted a mission. Rumsfeld aborted a mission at one point that could have gotten Zawahiri, and instead they focused on Iraq and Iran much more, and generally did not, do the 100%.
Right. And Bill Clinton let Osama bin Laden go before 9/11. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around.
I would dispute the characterization.
I think that's an established fact.
I don't want to go too down to that.
But regardless, there is something interesting, Bill, that NDTV, the Indian TV, reported earlier this week that Musharraf's biography, which is, I guess, is a couple years old now, actually mentions we were tipped off that someone important in Al-Qaeda was living there. He mentions a house in Abbottabad, a safe house, in his book. I don't know. Have you heard about this? Okay. That might be.
I think I heard about it from the
it's weird because apparently the way he spelled Abbottabad is different than the way it's really spelled in the book. And I mean, NewsHour posted it, PBS NewsHour, so I guess that lends it an air of credibility. But it is in his book, and the whole thing, I mean, you're right. I think Bush and McCain were, at least in terms of rhetoric, much too trusting of Musharraf. But the other thing, too, is, and I feel this way about Obama, like I don't know that it's fair to hold what presidents say, to sort of hold them to it, in the sense that when it comes to foreign policy, because it very well could be that Bush and McCain never really trusted Musharraf, but had to say nice, felt they had to say nice things about him because he was the only game in town. Do you know what I'm saying?
I mean, I think you're right in a lot of instances, and I do think too often I felt this way during the developments in Egypt, where people were extrapolating out, huge presumptions based on one or two utterances President Obama said, and ignoring the fact that things that might be going along very differently behind the scenes. So,
right.
If I saw a lot of evidence that there was more going on in Pakistan and more attempts to get bin Laden than otherwise known based on the president's rhetoric, President Bush's rhetoric, I would retract, my previous conclusions. But there's been other reporting to suggest that they not only were saying it, they were doing it. They were respecting the Pakistanis' demand that we don't put troops over the border there. And there's even one case where the Pakistani government literally had a peace deal with some of the tribal militants that were Al-Qaeda sympathizers, and Bush publicly endorsed it. He was very much trying to damp down expectation that there would be a hot pursuit for bin Laden. At one point he said in the second term, I don't think about him that much. Again, that's the kind of line that somewhat I might think, well, maybe that's just a little bit of trash talk, throw him off his guard, but there's other reporting to suggest that their actions actually match with the rhetoric.
Well, this will be a slight aside, but another sort of interesting story has been the conflating of Obama and Osama. I've tried not to do that here today. I've tried to start calling him bin Laden. I've tried to start calling him bin Laden to avoid it. It could happen to anybody. It really could, and it has happened to a lot of people. I've been guilty of it myself. I don't think on national TV or anything, but
well, I mean, I don't think it is a scarlet letter if you have an honest stumble. I mean, the names are similar. There's only one letter of difference.
Well, and plus, it's not like you're not talking about them both at the same time. I mean, they're in the same story. Right. Obama ordered the killing of Osama,
right,
of bin Laden.
I think there have been other instances during the 2008 presidential campaign where there were more deliberate mix-ups of the two names. But in the past week, I think the flubs that have happened have been honest flubs.
Yeah, there have been a lot of them, a lot of public ones. The other thing, too, is, I mean, if the story's breaking, it's Sunday night, you're a little bit hungover, I don't know, you're half, whatever it is, and all of a sudden this story breaks, you may not be, you can make apologies for folks who mess up. So the other thing, too, is I try to be, really, when it comes to stuff like this, I try to be really forgiving of those sorts of things, because it's like if you start making fun of people for a grammar mistake, then you can never make one yourself, ever, right? So I try to be keep the expectations low.
That's very wise. Well, I just want to get your final 2012 thoughts. We're taping this on Thursday. By the time this airs, the first presidential debate will have already occurred, so we can't pontificate about that. But, of course, most of the top-tier candidates won't even be there. Is there a sense, are you hearing things from Republican circles? Are there things on conservative blogs that are saying, okay, Obama won this week, but we can still get him on the foreign policy issues over here, we should focus on economic issues over here? Or is there a sense of fait accompli, like there's just no way we can beat this guy, we thought maybe we had him on the ropes for a bit, but now we don't? What is the overarching sense in either established Republican circles or conservative blog circles where the party goes from here?
So I don't think the bin Laden thing changes much, because I think the election is going to be about the economy, and I think the public's fickle, may not be fair. But ultimately, I think that we're pretty much where we were a couple weeks ago. I give Obama the edge, not because he's great, but because the Republican field is so weak. I think the change that I've seen, if there's any, is I think it's much more likely that Mike Huckabee gets in the race. Still a lot of reasons he shouldn't, including the fact that he's making good money at Fox. But I feel like there's much more of a chance today that he gets in.
But isn't the field weak because more stronger candidates are making the calculation that it's not winnable?
I don't think so, Bill. That was the case in '92 when Bill Clinton snuck in. I think the reason...
Well, I think Democrats made that calculation in '92 and they were just wrong, that it was winnable and the bigger names stupidly backed out.
Yeah, no, you're right. But I don't think that's... I don't think people are staying out because they're afraid of Obama. Because the people that might be staying out because they're afraid of Obama, it might be someone like, say, Mitch Daniels or Mike Huckabee, and I don't think they're all that strong anyway. I think the problem is that we're like, the Republican Party is like a football team that stuck with their veterans too long, and they didn't nurture enough rookies. And so right now we're seeing holdovers. The people who are ready to run for president today are essentially holdovers from the Bush era. And the future, I think, is with the next crop, is with Nikki Haley and Marco Rubio and Chris Christie and Mike Pence, who will be governor of Indiana, and Bobby Jindal. I think, Governor Martinez in New Mexico. A lot of really good talent out there, but I think they're not ready this time around. That's got nothing to do with Obama, them being afraid of Obama. It's all that they're just not ready at this point. That's my take anyway.
All right. Should we leave it on that note, sir?
Let's do it, man. Good
talking with you. Always a good talk with you.
All right. So we're going to say goodbye, or
you're usually better. You're better at the goodbyes.
I'm usually good at it. All right, let me try this. You can listen to us on the podcast. You can check us out on Twitter at The Weekend Blog, and we'll see you next week on The Week and Blog.
Take care.
Stay classy, San Diego.